Who is Steven Stayner? Stephen Gregory Stayner was born to parents Delbert and Kay Stayner on April 18, 1965, in Merced, California. He had 3 sisters and 1 older brother. The Stayner family would live a relatively normal life until December 4, 1972, when everything would change. This family would seemingly never get any reprieve for the rest of their lives. On Monday, December 4, 1972, 7-year-old Steven Stayner was on his way home after school when a stranger approached him. The stranger claimed to be a man named Kenneth Eugene Parnell, who said that he was a church representative and asked local people if they would be willing to donate to the church. Steven said that his mother would be willing to, which led Parnell to ask where he lived so he could get his mother's information. When Steven told him where he lived, a white Buick pulled up beside them. Steven willingly crawled into the back seat, and this began the dramatic tale of Steven Stayner. Once Steven was in the car, he would be driven to a cabin in Cathays Valley, which was about half an hour northwest of Merced. Unbeknownst to his family, he would be held captive here within proximity to his own grandfather's home. It is important to know that Parnell was not working alone. He was actually working with another person, Irvin Edward Murphy. Kenneth was a troubled man, to say the least. He had a rough youth and spent many years in prison before kidnapping Steven. When he was 5, Kenneth's father, Cecil Frederick Correll, walked out on his mother and his 3 siblings. Following this event, Kenneth began a string of crimes, including car theft and arson, which led to him spending many years in juvenile detention. He was just warming up at this point. In a newspaper article written about Kenneth, it says, "He has shown a peculiar tendency to search for trouble and punishment," reported Dr. Richard D. Lemberg, a psychiatrist who examined Parnell in 1951 at the behest of the Kern County Superior Court. Kenneth would also exhibit strange behavior throughout his life. When he was 4 years old, he would try to remove his own teeth with his fingers, despite them not even being loose. I can't even imagine how hard that would be. I don't even like to think about it. Let's move on. Around the age of 8 or 9, he shot himself in the abdomen and jumped off the roof of a barn onto a wooden plank with hundreds of nails sticking out of it. This guy likes pain. He's a masochist at 9 years old. Deputy badge, he just would lie around from a thrift store, portray himself as a police officer, which guys just love to do. Ted Bundy did it. There's a handful of them. He would then severely assault the young boy and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. But then he would escape, and in 1951, when he was 20 years old, Kenneth would lure an 8-year-old boy who would retire be brought back to serve the rest of his term. As you can see, Kenneth was very much not well from the beginning, so it is no surprise that he would continue to be a terrible person for years to come. Murphy had met Kenneth at a resort at Yosemite National Park, where they were co-workers. Kenneth was a nighttime janitor, a perfect job for a psycho. It is unclear what Murphy's job exactly was. However, while working, Kenneth was able to convince Murphy to help him to abduct children, so he could, quote, raise them in a religious-type deal. When friends and family were asked to describe Murphy, they said, those who knew him saw him as a trusting, naive, and simple-minded man. What a great description of somebody. If somebody called me a trusting, naive, simple-minded woman, I'd be offended, to be honest. And Kenneth clearly took advantage of Murphy, given these qualities. Kenneth was the one driving that white Buick that abducted Steven, and it was also his cabin in Cathays Valley that Steven was taken to. So, Murphy would be left on the sidewalk when Kenneth and Steven took off in the Buick. On the very first night that Steven was captive, he was unfortunately assaulted by Kenneth, and roughly 2 weeks later, he would be assaulted regularly by Kenneth. Steven obviously wanted to go home. He's just a scared little kid at this point, and I hope these guys burn in hell for this. His captor would tell Steven that his parents had given him legal custody to be his parent, and that they basically just didn't want him anymore. I can't even imagine what that would do to a little child psychologically. Steven said, the first night they had said they called my parents and said it was all right that I stayed a night. The second night, they said that they had called him again and said that I could stay another night. Then one of them went out and came back and said that he went to court and got possession of me and said that I was his. Eventually, Kenneth would change Steven's name to Dennis Gregory Parnell, and would also enroll him into numerous schools while in captivity just to remain normal-looking to the rest of society. Kenneth would move around California for years and hold down various jobs, leaving Steven at home alone a lot. He also would allow Steven to drink at a very young age and let him freely leave whenever he really wanted to, but Steven would always come back. Steven stated that he could have left at any point, really, but he just didn't know where to get help. A random woman named Barbara Mace lived with Steven and Kenneth for about a year and a half while they were in the Santa Rosa area. During that time, Barbara claimed that she had no idea what was happening and fully assumed that Kenneth and Steven were father and son, allegedly. What is even more strange is that Steven would tell interviewers that in 1975, Kenneth would instruct Barbara to lure a young boy into their car just outside the Santa Rosa Boys Club, but the kidnapping attempt would be unsuccessful. Barbara. Sounds like it's not a legend anymore. But yeah, I find it really hard to believe that Barbara was completely clueless about what was going on between Kenneth and Steven. Despite Steven calling Kenneth Dad, it should have been obvious by his body language that Steven was not comfortable with Kenneth ever, and that the two were not related because they didn't look alike either. Plus, who would be willing to go along with a kidnapping of a child so nonchalantly, especially if the person was instructed to do so? In my opinion, she knew what she was doing. In an interview, Steven was asked how long before he started calling him Dad. He replied, "That started about a week after my abduction." When asked what his thoughts were about his parents during the 7 years, Steven said, "I don't remember what went through my mind, but I thought of my parents very often." Steven would have to suffer for years in captivity, traveling around with Kenneth while being violated by him regularly. It had to be absolutely torturous and miserable. However, in early 1980, Steven would see and take an opportunity. On March 1st, 1980, 14-year-old Steven would finally escape the grasp of his captor and get the help he so desperately needed. But he wasn't alone. As sickening and disgusting as it sounds, Kenneth grew less interested in Steven as time went on, almost as if he doesn't like boys after they hit puberty, because you know he's a creep. Parnell and Steven together realized that Steven was growing up and that he was no longer going to be able to be controlled by Parnell. Parnell wanted another kid. So, once Steven hit puberty, Kenneth started to go out and look for younger boys to kidnap and basically replace him. Furthermore, as Steven got older, Kenneth would start to use Steven to abduct younger boys, which reminded me of a movie I really like, because it was really well done with Angelina Jolie, The Changeling. It was based on a different case, but it's a very interesting movie with a similar premise. This guy used boys to abduct other boys. So, at this point, he's using Steven to do what Murphy did to Steven. Each time, it was unsuccessful because Steven would basically purposefully sabotage the attempt every single time. Props to Steven. This led Kenneth to start resenting Steven. However, in February 1980, Steven and a friend, Randall Poorman, would kidnap a 5-year-old boy named Timothy White in the city of Ukiah, California. On the night of March 1st, Kenneth would leave for his job as night security, as he usually did, which meant that Steven and Timmy were now alone. However, as mentioned previously, this wasn't abnormal at all. It happened all the time. But Steven would grab Timmy, and they would hitchhike into nearby Ukiah, where he would try to find Timmy's house. After searching for a while, he couldn't. So he ended up going to a police station. When questioned, Steven would say, "I know my first name is Steven." This line would become infamous after he was brought home, and the media coverage began to look into the case. "I Know My First Name is Steven" became the title of the book. It became a television movie, and it made Steven famous. 7 long years ago, a youngster in California vanished. Everyone thought he was dead. At this point, he rescued another boy. This is Steven today. He is holding 5-year-old Timothy White. Who could make this up? Every television network, every magazine cover, every movie executive. There wasn't anyone not interested. On March 2nd, Parnell was arrested at his job and charged with abduction. Luckily, both children would be reunited with their families, and Parnell would, thank God, be convicted of 2 counts of kidnapping. So, he was sentenced to 7 years and parole after 5. What? It's just not enough time. It's not even close. He kidnapped a child and did awful things to him for years. I don't understand the justice system. Parnell was not charged for the assault that occurred in Merced County, since he was apprehended in Mendocino County and was outside of the statute of limitations. I guess that makes sense, but still, kidnapping is only 7 years, especially for the length of time that he had Steven. Are you kidding me? Irvin Murphy and Randall Poorman would be convicted of lesser charges for aiding in the kidnapping of both children. Steven would recall that Murphy was extremely kind to him when he was first held captive and told investigators that he believed that Murphy was as much a victim as he was. It's hard because I understand to a certain degree. Maybe the same thing happened to Murphy. I'm not even sure. We're not sure. It happened to Steven. He was groomed and then made to kidnap people. And it's just that Stockholm Syndrome. When you're a child, they're so easily moldable and easy to take advantage of, unfortunately. I don't know how to feel about Murphy and stuff. I do think that he was a victim, absolutely. But you have to know what's right and wrong, you know? But the case of Steven Stayner is a very traumatic yet brave tale of a boy who persevered through horrible conditions while saving another from the same fate. In a news clip, Steven is asked, "Were you afraid?" He replied, "Not that much. I was a little bit." The case would absolutely blow up on the news and attract lots and lots of media attention, leading to Steven and Timmy gaining some fame. As soon as Steven was returned to his family, he actually began touring around the nation to different morning shows and numerous interviews in front of his family home, which I can't even imagine. After going through that as a kid, he's 14, and then having to do all that. What a nightmare. Over the past 7 years, Steven had been living in the shadows, just yearning to escape. But now that he's free and was thrust into the spotlight, it kind of became unavoidable. And on Good Morning America, Steven was asked if his parents had changed at all, if he recognized his siblings, and things like that, all while his lawyer was present. While it was great to have Steven back home, he really struggled to get back into normal life. He was used to being an only child, first of all, so having to share a room with his brother, Cary, and share things with his other siblings was a relatively new concept for him. People believed that his siblings were happy to see him. However, it was believed that Cary, his older brother, wasn't too keen on sharing a room with him. In the background of one interview, you can see Cary in his baseball cap, and he's not smiling at all. When Steven returned to school, he was absolutely ostracized by his peers, not only because cameras constantly surrounded him, but the public knew that he had been taken advantage of by an old freak. So his peers would question his sexuality and even infer that he enjoyed it. Kids are so cruel, and I know it was a different time. I mean, kids still do that even now. Oh my God, I can't even imagine that life. That life is insane. So much sympathy goes out to him and his family and everything. I can't even imagine. This would obviously cause Steven to drop out of high school and start drinking, leading to a very strained relationship with his father, who would inevitably kick him out of his home. In an interview with Newsweek, Steven told reporters that his father would refuse to hug him once he was home and that the cameras were away, which is so sad. You would think that after losing your child for 7 years, you'd show a little bit of compassion. But his father's almost as much of a heartless monster as Parnell, in my opinion. Steven would say in an interview, "I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me the fundamentals all over again, it got better. But why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? I guess 7 years changed him too." So sad. Steven would continue dealing with reporters and cameras for years and years after the trials. But in 1985, he would get married to a 17-year-old named Jody Edmondson and have 2 children, Steven Jr. and Ashley. His family would live in Merced, California, the place where he was abducted. He would work at a pizza shop, and on the side, Steven would work with Child Abduction Group, basically to aid in the search for missing children and prevent more from disappearing. Basically, he's a saint. However, on September 16, 1989, on his way home from work, Steven's motorcycle would collide with Antonio Lopez's car, and it would kill him almost instantly. So, once again, the Stayner family would lose their child in another tragic event. Except this time, it was not only his parents who lost a son. It was siblings who lost a brother, a wife who lost a husband, and 2 children who lost a father. Shortly before he died in 1989, a 2-part miniseries would be released with the title I Know My Name is Steven, and the plot would detail Steven's entire story, including him getting abducted to him arriving at the police station with Timmy White, and so on. Following his death, a book would be written by author Mike Eccles of the exact same name. So, all this media would basically immortalize Steven in his story. However, the city of Merced wanted to honor him even further. So in 2010, the city would reveal a large bronze statue with Steven standing, holding Timmy White's hand, leading him away from the cabin. Steven's story was heroic and tragic at the same time, and the statue will forever remind passers-by of his struggles and his yearning for a normal life. But most of the attention that Steven was receiving was leaving his siblings feeling neglected by their parents. He had been missing for 7 years, so it's not unimaginable that the parents would put all this attention on him when he came back after being abducted. While his other siblings would be able to deal with it, Cary, on the other hand, would not. He would grow incredibly spiteful and then gain some of his own media attention in the years to come. And this is where the crazy twist of events comes in. While Steven's story was abruptly ended by tragedy, Cary, the lesser-known Stayner brother, was about to write his own, one far darker than anyone else could have ever imagined. He would become the Yosemite Killer. On a sightseeing trip to Yosemite, Carol's son, her daughter Julie, and their friend Sylvina Peloso vanished in February of 1999. Weeks later, Carol's and Sylvina's bodies were found in their charred rental car down a cliff. We have recovered 2 bodies from the trunk of the vehicle. But where was Julie? The killer sent the FBI this hand-drawn map with a chilling message. We have fun with this one. When Steven disappeared at 7 years old, his older brother, Cary, who was 11 at the time, was completely distraught. He was a big brother and likely felt guilty that he couldn't protect his younger brother. And Steven's kidnapping would haunt Cary for years and years to come. Remember going out one night after Steve disappeared and wishing on a star that my brother would come back home. I did that almost every clear night from then on until Steven finally came back home. I never did tell anyone about it, but I remember wishing on a star that my little brother would come back home. Sounds sweet, right? Well, he's a murderer, so less sweet. This became such a ritual for Cary that he continued doing it even after Steven came home. He would still go out every single night, walk several blocks away, pick a star, and begin to repeat the wish that Steven would return home before he would remember that Steven was home and he was safe. So he would then thank the star instead. Again, sounds really sweet until you find out he's a murderer. The sad fact about Cary's when the book, I Know My Name is Steven, came out, Eccles would quote Cary saying, "My childhood after Steven was rediscovered was basically that he was overshadowed by Steven and had essentially been left behind. He was only 11 at the time, so he really still needed guidance, but everything became about Steven. They would withdraw emotionally from Cary and would just put their sole focus into finding Steven. And then when Steven was found, they would put their sole focus into all the media attention that was happening and into how he was doing in everything. Delbert, the father, would swing between 2 versions of himself, one that was consumed with despair and depression, and one that would solely focus on finding Steven. I can't imagine being a sibling at that time, watching your parents just basically implode from the inside out and not parenting you because they're so focused on that. I obviously have sympathy there as well, but less because he inevitably became a killer anyway. The children that they did have were neglected in favor of the child that they lost. And Cary would have unique gifts and talent that his parents wouldn't see because the spotlight was on the missing Steven. While he attended Merced High School, he would actually be nominated as the most creative student, with many believing that he would actually become a graphic artist and cartoonist when he got older. And he also played baseball where he was positioned in the outfield, which I was too. Not that I want to have any qualities similar to a killer or anything, but I just thought that'd be an interesting little fact about me. Left field was my position. Cary was a very quiet and reserved individual, potentially feeling like his feelings or opinions weren't valued by his family, because they were more focused on the child that they lost. But he was also described as one of the nicest people you could meet and was rarely bothered by anything. He didn't really have any anger issues or anything like that. Cary would be 18 by the time his brother came home, basically a man standing on his own merits and probably fully accepting that he would never see his brother again. But his brother, would come into the picture again, thus thrusting Cary back into the shadows. Of course, Cary was glad that Steven was home, even thanking the stars that he had wished countless times for his brother to come back. But Steven was home, and with that came the media firestorm yet again. Steven would just come home, a hero, basically. Neighbors who lived near the Stayners for about 20 years recalled Steven's return home, basically made Cary just return to being the brother. Michael Coleman specifically lived next to the Stayners for about 20 years and would tell us Gate. When Steven came home, Cary was put back on the shelf. He was in the background, always. And Victoria Flores Tatum, another longtime neighbor, told SF Gate. Cary was very frustrated at all the publicity Steven was getting. I think Cary wants as much attention as Steven got. And he would. Cary's alienation and internal turmoil were compounded by his brother's untimely death in 1989. Just as Steven seemed to be finding a sense of normalcy in life, Steven died in a motorcycle accident. The death was tragic, but it only further to solidify Steven's hero fame even after he was dead. This would leave Cary to just grapple with his own feelings of inadequacy and emotional distance from his family. The alienation and loss of his home could have been what made Cary want to move in with his uncle Jesse Stayner. So, in 1990, while Cary and Jesse were living together, Jesse was found in his home, dead from one gunshot. The murder was investigated, but the killer was never found. I think I might know who it was. When the murder of Cary's uncle Jesse was reported in the newspaper, it would be Steven Stayner's name that was used in the headlines, not Cary's. Cary's name would not be mentioned at all in the article. It would say, Steven Stayner's uncle murdered. You're really poking the bear, media. Cary, who had found work in multiple trade jobs, such as moving, worked for a long time as a glass cutter, where he'd fix broken windows and install new ones. At one such job, he'd be working with a longtime friend, Mike Mares, who found him punching plywood until he bled and just kept going. Cary had told Mike that he was basically having a nervous breakdown and that he wanted to drive into work and kill everyone there and then torch the place. Just a big red flag right there. If you ask me, following this incident, Cary would become a handyman at Cedar Lodge in El Portal on Highway 140, heading towards Yosemite National Park. We're getting there. Cedar Lodge is positioned in an absolutely beautiful area, surrounded by mountains, and it's isolated due to the national park's proximity. How convenient. This was basically a peaceful place for everyone, and Cary could enjoy the beautiful mountains and would often smoke a little pot while sunbathing naked. I don't know why we know that information, but we do. The tranquility would persist until 1999 when Carol's son, her daughter Julie, and Julie's friend Sylvina Peloso went missing along with Carol's 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix. The search for these women would be the largest ever mounted in Yosemite at any time, according to at the time FBI agent Jeff Rennick, who was handling the case. After several weeks, all three women's bodies would unfortunately be discovered. The girl's car was discovered 60 miles away from the lodge, having been set on fire with two bodies in the trunk. Julie would be discovered about 40 miles away from a burned-out car after investigators received a letter in the mail containing a roughly drawn-out map. Investigators get a break. A letter in the mail with a crude map showing an area about 40 miles from where the burned car was found. Earlier this afternoon, investigators discovered the body of a homicide victim. The body of 15-year-old Julie Sund was identified earlier in the week. A group of ex-cons would come into the sights of investigators. Michael Roy Larwick and his half-brother, Eugene Earl Dykes, were the top suspects at the time. Dykes had multiple convictions on gun, drug, and sexual charges, and Larwick, whose childhood home was near the abandoned, torched car, allegedly shot at a police officer trying to pull him over days after the vehicle was discovered. So, they would obviously be taken into custody and questioned about these three women's murders. Larwick denied killing anyone, saying that they had the wrong guy, basically. But it's understandable why federal agents would think that they had the man responsible, given all the connections, basically. Considering that Larwick's criminal history included assault and other sexual assault and attempted manslaughter, and even an arrest where he would be found with a rocket launcher. But Larwick would even offer to submit to a polygraph test, and he would also offer his DNA to clear his name. He'd be quoted on saying, "I ain't got nothing to do with this. I've done a lot of things. I'm no angel, but you got the wrong guy. He's a piece of work. I have no sympathy for him." But he didn't do it, clearly. And investigators would now naturally have the wrong guy, which would become apparent when Joie Armstrong disappeared in July of 1999, 5 months after the first 3 killings. 26-year-old Joie Armstrong, a naturalist working at Yosemite, was living on the west side of the park. At her cabin, police would find signs of struggle, and her decapitated body would be found half a mile away with her head just floating in the water nearby. Investigators would find a lot of evidence at Joie's crime scene, and Cary Stayner's car was very distinctive. It had been seen at the area during the times of the murder. So he was initially brought in as a witness to see if he had seen anything suspicious. He had been found at a nudist colony after another person recognized him as a person of interest to investigators and called the authorities. But at this point, Cary still wasn't suspected of committing the crimes, and the investigators were actually familiar with him after having questioned him after the first 3 murders. They just basically wanted to ask him questions at this point. So, when FBI agent Jeff Rennick finds him at a nudist colony, they find it odd that he raises his hands above his head. Way to give it away, dude. Cary was not treated like a suspect at all. When he was being questioned, he and 2 other agents were eating pizza, and that's where he began to spill his guts and tell the investigators that he could give them more information about Joie Armstrong and more. Cary would confess to Jeff Rennick, while alone, that he killed Joie Armstrong, as well as Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. Jeff Rennick has actually written a book about it titled In the Name of the Children, an FBI agent's relentless pursuit of the nation's worst predators. And in this book, he details the time he spent with Cary Stayner and the horrifying request he made during his confession. That connection ultimately got Stayner to confess to killing Joie Armstrong, but before admitting to killing the sightseers, Rennick says Stayner tried to negotiate. He wanted images of young girls, his family to get the reward money, and to end up in a federal prison near his family. Rennick recalls asking him to pick one. What's the one thing? It's the one thing only. And what he chose? For Cary's confession, he established conditions for his continued cooperation. He wanted his family to get the reward money for the discovery of the women that he killed. He also wanted to be placed in a prison close to his family. And finally, he wanted images and videos of the young girls. He actually thought that they would give these things to him if he dangled a confession in front of the investigators' faces. This guy couldn't be a bigger monster. The audacity of this monster, my God. But investigators would tell him that he could pick one of the things that he wanted so much, and he would choose the images of the little girls over the money for his family and the proximity to his family. It's a nightmare. Of course, he would confess after not receiving the photos, as Jeff Rennick would tell him of the catharsis that he would feel if he did confess. And there might have also been, which I think is a big possibility, that he just wanted to seize any sort of spotlight or fame from these crimes, given that the spotlight was taken away from him so many times from his brother so many decades ago. And Cary would claim that these inclinations of death and murder would predate Steven's kidnapping when he was as young as 6 and 7 years old. He would be 37 at the time of apprehension. So he had avoided succumbing to these desires for about 3 decades and may continue to fight these demons today as he sits on death row, which I'm sure he does. So, why might Cary have finally given in after so long? Perhaps it was inevitable. But a psychiatrist that evaluated Cary for his defense team found that the Stayner family experienced extensive mental illness. Steven had been kidnapped by a creep, but he wasn't the only one that suffered these abuses. Steven and Cary's father, Delbert, had been ordered into therapy after sexually assaulting his own daughters. And even Cary himself would begin peeping in on his sister, and even touching her inappropriately when she was only 10 years old. And Cary had even become a victim of sexual assault from his own Uncle Jesse Stayner, mere months after Steven's disappearance. If you remember, Jesse was killed by a gunshot. So, after Cary Stayner was convicted for those other murders, Jesse Stayner's case would be reopened. History of sexual assault in the Stayner family seemingly went back generations, which is horrific, making the fact that Steven would be kidnapped by somebody that committed the same a cruel twist of fate and a very unfortunate irony. Cary seemed so normal throughout his childhood and adulthood, and even his friends didn't suspect him of doing anything like this. It just goes to show that you never know when somebody's hiding a very dark side to them, and that deep-seated trauma can manifest when you least expect it. So, the story of the Stayner brothers is intriguing for many reasons. Their childhoods and how they ended up in adulthood offer a compelling example of the nature versus nurture concept, which I always talk about during most of the true crime deep dives that I do. Both brothers endured trauma, yet their paths led in entirely different directions. Steven would become a symbol of resilience and strength, while Cary became a serial killer and a cautionary tale. Steven's was a 7-year-long nightmare, where he was sexually assaulted nightly at the hands of his captor. When he emerged from captivity, he was a hero for his rescue of a young boy, and he was able to function well enough to find a wife and even start a family. Cary faced trauma that had similarities, yet some differences, to Steven's. He was allegedly assaulted by his uncle, someone he should have felt safe and protected by. Grappling with this just compounded the emotional vacuum left by his brother and his parents' neglect. It left him isolated in his own way, just as Steven was. But unlike Steven, Cary never really received any sort of public attention or support that may have helped him process these feelings of neglect and rage. Perhaps Cary's life could have had a different outcome if he was treated like an equal and was supported by his siblings and his parents. That said, if his statements of his very dark inclinations predated the abduction of Steven and are factual, then perhaps it was inevitable. One could speculate that Steven was somehow motivated by the spotlight that he had gained to make more of an effort towards having a normal life. In contrast, Cary, the one in the shadows, didn't have the same fire lit beneath him to pursue that kind of normal life. I think the greatest shame, and honestly one of the cruelest ironies of this whole story, is that Steven, a boy who saved another young boy from the horrors that he suffered for so many years, was the one who had his life cut short with so much in his future. Cary, the brother who would go on to murder 4 women, lives to this day. And though it may be on death row, he got to breathe the pleasures that life offered for 37 years. And though now in prison, he continues to create his art. So, that about wraps up the story. It's a very, very crazy case. I was reading about it, and I just couldn't believe it. I hope you got something out of the video today. Another cautionary tale. If you will, be careful out there. Obviously, my heart goes out to the family and friends of the victims. I also want you guys to know that I donate part of the proceeds of these videos to victims' families to help people as well, because I think that's important. I think it's important to tell stories and to keep them alive, but I also think it's important to give back. I just wanted to let you guys know that. Also, let me know what else you guys want to see in the comments down below. I know I've been doing a lot of the true crime deep dives lately. Let me know if you want to see more.